Good morning. Welcome to Sri Ram Sayas. And in this series of history, we will talk some important topics. Myself, K. Sivesh, and we will discuss some of the important issues related to the examination, both prelims and mains. So in the series of modern India, let's talk today the revolt of 1857. The revolt of 1857, the year which changed everything. The year which changed everything. Ever since East India Company transformed into political power, the approach of the British government towards the company had already changed. And at the same time, there were opposition to the establishment of East India Company at regular intervals in various parts of India, because company was involved in exploitation. And as per the description of R.P. Dutt, 1757, this is the beginning of the phase of colonialism. So after almost 150 years, this company remained as a trading organization, and thereafter it had transformed into political power. And it led to the establishment of colonial phase in India. So 1757 to 1857, in 100 years, company was involved in strengthening its colonial character, exploitation of India to benefit England. And everybody was agree with this phenomena, that it was a colonial system. You can understand that even the British parliamentarians and British economists, they were having firm opinion that what British East India Company, a private organization of England, is doing in India. John Sullivan said that our system acts like a sponge, soaking good things on the bank of Ganges and squeezing at the river Thames. So this is how you visualize the entire process of exploitation. Our system acts like a sponge, soaking good things on the bank of Ganges and squeezing at the river Thames. So there was a massive drain of wealth, transfer of wealth and commodities from India to England. And you can understand that in 1757, India constituted 25% of the world's GDP. %50 of the total world's trade was alone constituted by India. Alone constituted by India. Total demand of handicraft in the whole world, the 50% was alone supplied by India. So you can imagine the level of trading influence, and that is the reason why India was a golden bird. But in 1857, if you even calculate the rough data, then you'll find that the GDP reduced to 4%, and this 50% of the world's trade reduced to 1%. That data was in 1947. So 1947, you'll find that how exploitative this mechanism was, India's contribution to world GDP. So once it had started in 1757 to 1857, 100 years of the company's rule, because of the massive exploitation carried out there were revolts. And it was not confined to one community or any social group. Almost all community had oftenly revolted. Sometimes peasants, sometimes tribals, sometimes civil rebellion. Even military also had caused the revolt at regular interval. It was a local revolt, it was a regional revolt. But these revolts were short-lived, categorically suppressed by the Britishers. But the revolt of 1857, it was definitely a collective outburst with huge participation of many sections of Indian society. And the intensity of the revolt was so high that it shook the backbone of company's rule in India. Company had lost control at many places. Therefore, the weakness or the hollowness of the company's regime had exposed. And British government, every time charging company, ever since company turned into political power, about the misadventure, miscalculation and misgovernance. So British government was charging company many times, and British government was continuously passing the act also to take the mechanism of control of India from East India Company to British Parliament. And in 100 years, India became necessity of British government. The British government could not afford to lose India at any cost. And that is the reason why in 1857, British government decided to abolish the company's administrative responsibilities. And then British Parliament had taken direct control over India. So that was a big change you can observe here after the revolt of 1857. So it was not a sudden revolt, but there was tradition of revolt at regular intervals. And ultimately, the intensity of the revolt was so high that change in India had triggered, and then the British government had taken the direct responsibility of India. So here we can have a very good question, and you can analyze the question that the changes in 1858, means after the revolt of 1857, was not a sudden change. What not a sudden change, but a long drawn policy of British rule in India. Long drawn policy of British rule in India. So it was not a sudden change, but it was a long drawn policy of British rule in India. What is meaning of this sentence? If you want to explain this sentence, then definitely you must explain all the acts passed by the British government ever since East India Company transformed into political power, regulating act, including the Charter Act 1813, 33, 1853, and you will find that each and every act, it was intended to take the control from the East India Company to the British Parliament. So therefore, it was not a sudden change, but it was a long drawn policy of British rule in India. So therefore, this could be summarized in such a fashion that what is called the revolt of 1857. There are so many structural things you will find here, and the question can be framed also in such a way that changes in 1858, was only structural and not functional. Only structural and not functional. That means, obviously, the approach of the British towards the India what was there before the revolt of 1857, it was continued even after that, because the relevance of India lies in its colonial relations. And the British government was subjecting all administrative experiment in India just to suit the requirement of the British colonial interest. So that is the benefit of the British colonial interest. So here the revolt, which you can summarize with various social, economic, politico-administrative reason, immediate military factor, and then immediate factor. Immediate factor. So look at the factors and then understand. I'm talking about the 100 years of the company's rule, from 1757 to 1857. There was a subjective role of each and every community getting exploited, and therefore they had an intensive effort. Remember one thing, don't conclude the fact that revolt was not having so much impact over entire India. It was confined to the local areas. That would be a miscalculation to understand, because after the revolt of 1857, one thing was very much changed in India, that the regional identity of the Indians, that common Indians were more comfortable in identifying themselves as a Gujarati, Marathi, Telugu, Tamil. Then regional identity was overshadowed by the national identity. This is a rise of nationalism. So those who actively participated in revolt, they were definitely having the sense of the anti-British sentiments. But those who even remained silent, sitting at home, those who even suppressing the revolt, their sentiments was definitely there with the rebellions. So don't forget out the thing and don't miscalculate the thing that it was not a national revolt. Because it's not only the things of participation. First time Indians had collective sentiments together. Those were sitting at home ideally, those were taking part in the suppression of the revolt. Their strong psychology and sentiments was there with the rebellion. And that is the reason why this revolt was very significant in the history of India. I told you, the year 1857, that had changed everything in India. That is in the perspective of India, not only India only, but at the same time India's relation with the England also. So this is the scenario of the revolt of 1857. You can look into the various dimensions, because it's a very complex issue with many dimensions. So we have to take multiple dimensions at a time to understand everything related to the revolt of 1857. So social, economic, political, in a quick summarization, not elaborately, I would like to convey you that this social factor, racial discrimination and racial abuse was common. It is the sense of superiority of the British that prompted British, justified British to establish the British rule in India. So Indians were not considered fit for higher services. Indians were not even allowed to mix with the Europeans. So there was a racial discrimination, and the British government always tried to put the whitesman hypothesis, that it is a whitesman burden to teach the lesson of civilization to the barbarians. The superiority of the Western culture and inferiority of the Eastern culture, that prompted justification of the British rule in India, all were very much applied over the time. So therefore, the racial discrimination is one factor. Racial discrimination is one factor. Along with interference in the social and religious affair, it was a massive interference. Introduction of English, introduction of Christian missionaries, and then various laws, forms to eradicate the evils of Indian society. But the conservative Indians who were not matured and aware enough to understand the evil things in the society. They understood that British is changing all these things in order to impose Christianity. Maybe on one hand, they would have accepted the abolition of sati or the passing of Widow Remarriage Act. But the parallel thing going on, that is the parallel thing, what is parallel thing, that is introduction of the Christian missionaries, introduction of English, had created apprehension, and therefore it forced Indians to oppose even the abolition of sati and the Widow Remarriage Act, all these things. So therefore that subjectively considered as a social factor that come across in the revolt. So we will elaborate with the examples whenever we come with the regular phenomena. But here the economic factor, obviously the peasant and the artisans, these are the two main economic group, and these two groups had main contributor of Indian economy. Aggressive land revenue administration, the agrarian relation, and supplemented by many land revenue settlements, permanent settlement, Mahalbari settlement, Rayatbari settlement. You will find that sometimes the rate of land revenue exceeds to 50 to 55%. You can imagine if you take the 50 to 55% of the total product as a land revenue, so 40% or the 45% left with the peasant, it was not enough so that they can eat throughout the year, resulted in poverty, famine, revolt, everything. So this is the regular phenomenon. Before the advent of the Britishers, we call P for peasant, P for prosperous. But now we deliberately say the P for peasant and P for poor. It's all. The peasants hardly revolted. But as long as the British rule keep on increasing, the intensity of the peasant revolt had also keep on increasing. It became very frequent. So look at the scenario of the revolt of 1857, the social factor, economic factor, political factor. In 100 years of the company's rule, 60% of the Raja Nawab, they lost their estate. So 60% of the Raja Nawab, when they dispossessed from their land, these are the local powerful group in the Indian social system, and they either participated in revolt or they provoked others, provided logistics in the participation of the revolt of 1857. They had provided a local setup during the revolt of 1857. Military, this unit was a very significant unit in terms of the revolt of 1857. So military revolted mainly because of the racial discrimination. Racial discrimination means salary, pension, appointment, promotion, dress, diet, everything was discriminatory. And then other factor, the Indian military, it is considered as peasant in uniform. So peasant in uniform, that is, inside they are peasant because all were the son of the soil, son of the peasant, but they had joined the military. So obviously every impact on peasantry would be loudly expressed by military. So military did not revolted only because of the military factor, but the peasant factor also guided them. So this dual factor made the military factor very intense factor, and that is how sometimes we can say the military revolt as a Sepoy mutiny also. Sepoy mutiny also. Sometimes we can say it is a Sepoy mutiny also. So military did not revolted mainly because of the military factor, but the peasant factor also guided them. And then immediate factor is introduction of the Enfield rifle. So that is a heavy category rifle that was introduced and then the revolt of Mangal Pandey, the soldiers of 34th Native Infantry at Barakpur. And Mangal Pandey, he tried to kill his commander, Lieutenant Bagh, after defying the orders of using the Enfield rifle. And then Mangal Pandey was hanged. He was put before the cannon. Either he was hanged or either he was put before the cannon. But he was the first rebellion of the revolt of 1857 who lost the life. So after the death of Mangal Pandey, when the Mangal Pandey became martyr, obviously there was a high grade intensity of discontent against the British among the Indian soldiers, and that caused the revolt of 1857. So these are the summarization that we have to make step by step and one by one. There are some other factors also causing the social and military. That is, British had passed Lex Loci Act. I hope you know the Lex Loci Act, otherwise we will see in detail. Lex Loci Act, a Religious Disabilities Act. So Lex Loci Act says that if any Indians had changed the religion, then his father could not debar him from the property right. If Indians had changed the religion, his father could not debar him from the property right. So there means the many Indians had understood that British is trying and prompting to convert to Christianity and providing them the elaborate safeguards. Okay, fine. Then Religious Disabilities Act, and then we have General Service Enlistment Act. This General Service Enlistment Act if Indian soldiers appointed in foreign land, they would not get extra allowances. So obviously they have to work in the same bhatta. You understand bhatta? So they have to work in the same bhatta. And in this condition, the most of the Indians, they were very much discontented because their counterpart Europeans were getting, British were getting. So therefore the Indian soldiers had a high degree of discontent against the British. And even particularly the Hindu soldiers. The Hindu soldiers, they skipped the duty while appointed in foreign land. Because in Hinduism, it is a loss of religion. If you cross the oceans, if you cross the seas, that means it is a loss of religion. So that means they were skipping the appointment in the foreign land. So therefore, these are the factors which is considered as the causes of the revolt of 1857, which we can summarize one by one categorically. So we keep on looking so many dimensions of this revolt, like nature of the revolt, description of the Indian historian, description of the British historian, and then we have the summarization of the impact of the revolt, which is very significant, and factual part, that is the spread of the revolt. Sometimes in objective questions we have such explanation. So this is a big chapter, but this is a very hunting chapter from where we can get a question in prelims and question in mains as well. The two important sentences before I leave, I would like to put in your mind to analyze that questions that I have discussed in the beginning, that the changes in 1858 was only structural and not functional. So, and second thing is that changes in 1858 was not a sudden change, but it was the long drawn policy of the British government towards India. And a third thing, that you cannot summarize the revolt as a local and regional, but it was definitely a beginning of the nationalist consciousness. So if you are able to explain such sentences by having out of the box thought also, then it would be a nice idea to conclude this chapter. So it's a very easy going, it's nothing difficult. Simple thing is that the presentation must be very interesting, number one, and second, the topics must be closely monitored for one by one, step by step, approach of the revolt, nature, impact, everything. So keep in touch and have a nice day. Goodbye.